Star Trek heroes come in all types, all shapes and sizes and colors. Some have rubber glued to various parts of their heads, some are just normal. There's a lot of variety, but most of them have two things in common. They wear pajamas to work, and they are supremely self-confident. They are bold, brave go-getters. They believe in their mission, and they believe in themselves and their abilities. At least, that's how it looks to everyone else most of the time. If we were casual observers living in the world of Star Trek, we'd probably never have a reason to question the cool, composed, self-possessed impression presented by senior officers on a Starfleet ship. But we aren't casual in-world observers, we're audience members, and as such, we get the privilege of peeking behind the veil, of seeing these people in their private moments and learning what neurotic head cases they are. Some of them, anyway, particularly those who make up the cast of my favorite Star Trek series, Deep Space Nine. Of all the enemies faced by the heroes of Deep Space Nine, the Cardassians, the Founders, the Jem'Hadar, Nurse Ratched, Lionel Luthor, Dr. Prescott, the most difficult to defeat may have been their own self-doubt, their own fears that they weren't up to the challenges they faced week after week. There's a term for this: Imposter Syndrome, or the Imposter Phenomenon. Generally speaking, it refers to the belief that you are not as good or competent as other people think you are, or as you ought to be, that you are undeserving of your accomplishments or position, that you are in some way a fraud, and it's only a matter of time before others find you out. According to one estimate I saw while researching this video, I read the Wikipedia article, 70% of us will experience the imposter phenomenon at some point during our lives. With the cast of Deep Space Nine, I think the percentage is even higher. In fact, when I look at the regulars and important recurring characters on the show, it seems like for almost all of them, confronting and overcoming imposter syndrome is a major part of their character arcs. The clearest and most long-running example in the show is the series lead, Benjamin Sisko. He's not lacking in confidence in most ways. He's secure in his abilities as a Starfleet officer and as a father to his son Jake, and rightly so. We see that he's outstanding in both of those roles, but there is this one facet of his life where, for most of the series, he doesn't have that feeling of security. In Deep Space Nine's first episode, Emissary, Kai Opaka, the religious leader of the planet Bajor, informs Sisko that he is the emissary to the prophets, the godlike beings who live in the nearby wormhole and watch over Bajor. Needless to say, this is news to Sisko, who is not Bajoran and has never even been to Bajor before. For more than half of Deep Space Nine's 7-year run, Sisko is deeply ambivalent about his role as the emissary. Bajorans on the station, including his own first officer, Major Kira, regard him as a religious figure, though Kira keeps a lid on it most of the time. Sisko doesn't see himself that way. In the third season episode Destiny, when Major Kira suggests calling off an important mission because it appears an ominous Bajoran prophecy is about to be fulfilled, Sisko reminds her that he doesn't think of himself as the emissary, but as a Starfleet officer. The following season, in the episode Starship Down, Kira speculates to Dax that Sisko has intentionally scheduled the crew to take the Defiant through the wormhole for Gamma Quadrant trade negotiations in order to be away from the station during a Bajoran festival being held in his honor. Sisko feels undeserving of the status the Bajorans have bestowed upon him. At times, he seems to regard being the emissary as a burden. His job as commander of this space station, next to a planet still recovering from a devastating military occupation, which is also next to a wormhole to the other side of the galaxy, isn't hard enough. He's got to be a religious icon to millions of people, too. Sisko's discomfort with being the emissary is so significant in the early years of Deep Space Nine that in the fourth season episode A Session, when it briefly appears that someone else is the rightful emissary, Sisko immediately steps aside. But it's also at that point that Sisko's feelings about being the emissary begin to change. When the replacement emissary, Okorum, begins promoting regressive teachings that prove disruptive and harmful to Bajoran society, Sisko drags both of them back into the wormhole to ask the prophets to clarify which of them is their true emissary. And one way to describe this scene is to say that the prophets help Sisko get over his imposter syndrome. The prophets, doing that deal where they speak through the images of other characters, tell Okorum that he was not meant to be the emissary, but to help Sisko. The implication being that Okorum was sent so that Sisko would finally be able to accept that he was the emissary. There had been no mistake. The prophets had not somehow chosen the wrong guy. He was the emissary. They wanted him. After that episode, we see Sisko embracing his role as the emissary more fully. His ultimate fate in the series is wrapped up in the prophets and his service to them. After defeating Gul Dukat, who has become the Bajoran version of the Antichrist, Sisko is spirited away to live in the wormhole with the prophets full time. And even though it means leaving behind his life as a Starfleet officer and a father and a husband, he seems at peace with it. Not everyone on the show gets such definitive relief from their imposter syndrome, however. Major Kira, the station's first officer, experiences the imposter phenomenon, or something very much like it, when the person she is today is forced to reckon with the person she used to be. Before becoming an officer in the Bajoran militia, Kira was a resistance fighter during the Cardassian occupation. She was, in her own words, a terrorist. And though she is occasionally shown to be haunted by certain things she did back then, overall she seems pretty okay with having been a terrorist. The Cardassians invaded her home, killed and oppressed her people, and she and her fellow members of the Resistance did what they had to do to fight them. Kira's time in the Resistance prepared her for her job on Deep Space Nine in many ways. She's tough as nails, a formidable fighter, and a skilled strategist, but many of her duties are of a more bureaucratic, administrative nature, not necessarily in Kira's wheelhouse. We can speculate that perhaps she experiences some imposter syndrome while carrying out those duties, but it really comes through when she finds herself having to do something as an officer that she would never have done as a resistance fighter. In the first season episode Progress, Kira finds herself in the difficult position of having to forcibly evict an old man from his home on a Bajoran moon that is about to be tapped as an energy source. Kira strongly identifies with the old man named Mullabach, who fled to the moon decades ago after escaping a Cardassian labor camp. The Bajoran authorities want to forcibly relocate Mullabach, but Kira stalls for time, hoping to convince him to leave voluntarily. When that doesn't work, Sisko pays her a visit at Mullabach's farm where she's been staying. "You have a job to do here," he tells her, "and you're not doing it." When Kira protests that it's not that simple, Sisko says that he understands how she feels, but reminds her of who she is now. "You've spent your life fighting impossible odds just like him," Sisko says, "but you have to realize something. You're on the other side now." "It's awful," Kira says. She has to confront the fact that she is now what she once fought against. She is the authority. She is the person tasked with forcing a person from his home, the sort of thing she would have killed Cardassians for doing just a few years ago. Is this really who she's become? Is she okay with that? Can she be okay with that? There's another facet to Kira's imposter syndrome as well. It's not just that she's become a different person than she used to be, and she's not always sure how to feel about that. It's that she fears what the consequences might be if her current crewmates and friends learn the whole truth about who she was and what she did during the occupation. We see this explored in a second season episode titled Necessary Evil, in which we learn that about 5 years prior to the start of the series, Kira, then a member of the Resistance, was a suspect in the murder of a Bajoran merchant aboard the station, which at the time was controlled by the Cardassians. That murder was the first case investigated by Odo, who went on to become the head of security on the station. It's ultimately revealed that Kira is actually guilty of the murder and has kept the secret from Odo all these years. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Odo asks her. "I was afraid," Kira says. "What you think of me matters a lot." Odo is one of Kira's closest friends on the station. Their relationship is built on trust and mutual respect, and all this time, Kira knows she committed a murder and got away with it right under Odo's nose. Odo regards her as an honest and honorable person, but Kira knows that's not entirely true, and she worries. What happens when the truth comes out? What will he think when he finds out who I really am? Fortunately, though he is clearly affected by it, Odo is able to get past the revelation that Kira was the culprit in his first murder case, and it doesn't seem to harm their relationship at all. Maybe one of the reasons Odo gets over it so easily is because he knows he harbors his own dark secrets, which, if known, would force his crewmates, his friends, to see him in a different and darker light. In Season 5's Things Past, Odo is mysteriously transported 7 years into the past, along with Captain Sisko, Dax, and Garak. They're on Terok Nor, the name Deep Space Nine was known by during the occupation, and they've been quantum leaped into the bodies of Bajorans who were on the station at that time. Eventually, it turns out that the Bajorans they've leaped into were executed for crimes they didn't commit. When the ordeal is over, Odo, who was chief of security under the Cardassians at the time, confesses to Sisko that all the evidence pointing to their innocence was there at the time. He just didn't bother to examine it, because he was more concerned with maintaining order, and he never considered the possibility that he could be wrong. At the end of the episode, we get a reversal of the final scene of Necessary Evil. This time, Kira is the one who learns a hidden truth about Odo. And what she says to Odo after learning the truth is precisely what he must have hoped he'd never have to hear anyone say. "I believed in you. You were special. You stood for justice. Now what?" Odo's answer isn't very satisfying. He basically says he's imperfect, just like everyone else. But then again, how could it be satisfying? Kira's right. Up until now, he's stood for law, order, and justice. He's been like Deep Space Nine's answer to the Big Boss Man. Only without the nightstick, or the ball and chain, or the onus. But it turns out he ain't no Big Boss Man. He's just Big Bubba Rogers. Which isn't bad, to be clear, just less of a role model for the kids. And presumably he also moves a lot less merch. This was the 90s. Nobody bought heel t-shirts. Well, except for the NWO, but this episode premiered in November 96, and Big Bubba didn't join until December, so... I actually went back and rewatched some of those episodes of Nitro from the early months of the NWO, and I gotta say, they don't really hold up. It's more than just Odo's dark past working for the Cardassians that leaves him vulnerable to feeling like an imposter. His very nature as a shapeshifter whose natural form is a pool of goo renders him an outsider relative to the others, fundamentally different from everyone else aboard the station. Odo realizes this and is intensely, almost pathologically private. He allows almost no one to see him in his natural state. He's so unlike his crewmates, so alien. What would they think if they saw the real him? This fear comes rushing to the surface in the second season episode The Alternate, where Odo receives an unexpected and unwelcome visit from Dr. Mora, the Bajoran scientist who worked with and experimented on Odo after he was discovered. Mora is the closest thing Odo has to a father and knows him in ways no one else does, having been there during Odo's growth and development. When Odo is exposed to a strange gas and begins unconsciously wrecking the station and attacking crew members, Mora, who is the first person to realize what is happening, tries to convince Odo to return to Bajor with him. Odo resists and suggests going to Dr. Bashir. Mora goes straight for the soft spot, insists Dr. Bashir will not understand any of this. All he'll think is that you've somehow become an uncontrollable thing that tried to kill him. What do you think they'll do to you? Mora tells Odo that if his friends learn the truth, they'll quarantine him on a deserted planet or put him in a zoo. Think about what Mora is saying. You aren't who your friends think you are. If they find out who you really are, your life as you know it will be over. Doesn't that sound like it could be the frightened, insecure inner voice of someone experiencing imposter syndrome? It's an inner voice I can easily imagine many of Odo's crewmates on Deep Space Nine hearing as well. Like I said, it seems like almost every major character on the show goes through this at one time or another. I'm not going to go into detail with all of them, but for a few more examples, Jadzia Dax is outwardly a strong and self-assured person, but inside she harbors doubts about the circumstances that led to her being joined with her symbiont. She was the only candidate ever to be washed out from the selection process to be a symbiont host who then successfully reapplied. She wonders if Curzon Dax, the previous host of her symbiont, ever really thought she was good enough. In the third season episode Facets, she's able to confront Curzon about this while Curzon's consciousness inhabits Odo's body. Jadzia stands up for herself, asserts her value and worth, and learns the only reason Curzon objected to her being a host is that he was in love with her. After that, Curzon's consciousness returns to the Dax symbiont, allowing Jadzia to practice self-love in the most literal sense possible. Star Trek is weird, y'all. That which we see of Jadzia's imposter syndrome pales in comparison to what her successor as host of the Dax symbiont, Erzi, goes through when she joins the show in its 7th and final season. When Erzi arrives on the station in the episode After Image, she is everywhere, confronted by reminders of Jadzia. The Bajoran temple where Jadzia died, Quark offering her Jadzia's favorite drink, Bashir flirting with her as he used to do with Jadzia, Worf, Jadzia's husband, avoiding her because he would rather believe that Jadzia's spirit is in the Klingon afterlife than a part of Erzi, and finally, Garak, whom Erzi has been counseling, trying to help with his claustrophobia, lashing out at her, calling her a confused child, unworthy of carrying on Jadzia's legacy. Jadzia owned herself, Garak says. You don't even know who you are. Ultimately, Erzi does what Jadzia did. She stands up for herself, proves her value by returning to Garak after their ugly exchange and helping him discover what has been triggering his claustrophobia. And, after briefly considering leaving Starfleet, decides to remain in the service and on Deep Space Nine, where her crewmates begin to accept her, not as the new Jadzia, but as herself, as Erzi. Speaking of Garak, that thing that triggers his claustrophobia in After Image, it turns out it's that he feels like a traitor to his people for working with the Federation to win the war with the Dominion. He's been telling himself that he's doing it to end the war and save Cardassian lives, but he's also making it easier for Starfleet and its allies to kill Cardassians on the way to victory. And because of that, in his heart, he feels that he has betrayed his people. Garak's struggle between the person he is and the person he's been told he should be his entire life by his culture, by his imposing and remote and impossible-to-please father, is a fundamental part of his character. So is making sure none of the people he lives and works with on Deep Space Nine know too much about his past. In the classic second season episode The Wire, Garak, who is suffering from withdrawal after deactivating an addictive, pain-killing implant, tells Bashir, "You need to know who you're trying to save," implying that he doesn't deserve whatever help Bashir is offering. We never learn the whole truth about Garak's past, but we learn enough to know that he is simultaneously proud and ashamed of it. He believes in the greatness of his people, his world, and its strength and its traditions, but he also recognizes its brutality and corruption and his own role in maintaining that order. It's not hard to understand why Garak might feel out of place, like he doesn't belong no matter where he is, and why he might think it's better for his true self to remain a mystery to everyone, even himself. Quark is an ambitious businessman who feels stuck running a bar at an out-of-the-way space station. Plus, as the series goes on, he begrudgingly comes to value certain things above financial profit. Both of those things, his lowly status and his burgeoning conscience, leave him feeling alienated from Ferengi society. His brother Rom spends the first half of the series working at the bar, serving as Quark's flunky and usually unwilling partner in crime. Even after leaving Quark's to focus on his mechanical talents as a member of the station's engineering crew, Rom has to contend with that ever-present feeling that he's not good enough. Worf, who joins the series in Season 4, has been living with imposter syndrome in one form or another his whole life. A Klingon raised by humans. Too Klingon for the humans, too human for the Klingons. After arriving on DS9, it adds another layer as he transfers from security, where he's been for the bulk of his Starfleet career, to the command division, and faces the challenge of transitioning from a soldier who follows orders to a leader who gives them. Some of these require a pretty broad interpretation of the concept of imposter syndrome, I realize, but even if you think that term might not be the best way of describing the experiences of all of these characters, they at least have in common that uncertainty, that sense of not belonging, that feeling of being seen as something they're not, that is the root of the imposter phenomenon. And there is at least one character on Deep Space Nine who goes through something that even the most rigorously precise psychologist would have to admit meets the qualifications of imposter syndrome. We learn all about it in an episode from Deep Space Nine's 5th season, one which I've talked about before, but not quite from this angle. Dr. Bashir, I presume. This is the episode where it is revealed that Julian Bashir is a product of illegal genetic engineering, which his parents had him undergo as a child after noticing that he wasn't developing mentally and physically as quickly as his peers. This genetic engineering has been kept a closely guarded family secret for decades. If it were to be revealed, it would mean the end of Bashir's Starfleet career and prison for his parents. Bashir's mother and father visit the station at the invitation of Dr. Louis Zimmerman, who wants to speak to them as part of his research to create a new medical hologram based on Bashir. Speaking to the Bashir hologram, but thinking they are actually talking to their son, the Bashirs refer to the genetic engineering and are overheard by Zimmerman and Chief O'Brien. The secret is out. Julian talks things over with O'Brien, his best friend, and also the only major protagonist on the series who doesn't seem to suffer from imposter syndrome. He avoids it, so far as I can tell, by simply having no inner life whatsoever. And really, I can't blame him. Who has time for self-reflection when you're constantly being tortured? Anyway, Bashir tells O'Brien about the treatments that altered his genetic makeup, how his IQ jumped, how his size, reflexes, hand-eye coordination, and other physical attributes improved. He tells O'Brien about how he and his parents moved to a different city, how he was enrolled in a new school using falsified records, and how, after that, they never looked back. But the truth is, Bashir says, I'm a fraud. Before this episode, Bashir had experienced imposter syndrome in the same general, broadly defined sense that most of his crewmates had. There was some suggestion that his brashness, his enthusiasm for his work, and his energetic pursuit of the ladies were ways of compensating for some hidden insecurity. There were indications that he felt pressured to live up to his potential, to prove himself deserving of his success. But Dr. Bashir, I presume, reframes that characterization as being a product of Bashir having to live with the weight of this potentially ruinous secret. This was not the plan for Bashir all along. When the character was created, no one intended for him to have been a product of genetic engineering. That didn't become a part of his character until this episode was being written. So, The writers of Deep Space Nine pushed the development of Bashir's character in a new direction by intentionally giving him imposter syndrome. And they created a situation for him where feeling like an imposter was a pretty reasonable reaction. Bashir isn't the person everyone else thinks he is, at least in certain ways. And if people find out who he really is, he actually might lose everything. People might look at his accomplishments or his abilities and say, I knew he couldn't have done all that on his own. It's not just negative self-talk or paranoia, it's a logical expectation. Later in the episode, when Julian is arguing with his parents about what to do now that his secret is about to be revealed, he lays it all out. You decided I was a failure in the first grade, he tells his father. I stopped calling myself Jules when I was 15 and I found out what you'd done to me. Jules Bashir died in that hospital because you couldn't live with the shame of having a son who didn't measure up. Why does he feel like he wasn't good enough? Because, in the judgment of his parents, he wasn't good enough. Sure, his mother jumps in at that point and argues against that, insists that they did what they did out of love, not shame, not because they wanted a better son. She seems sincere, and Bashir is moved by what she says, but his parents still did what they did. And Julian's perception of himself as a fraud is still understandable. The truly compelling argument against Julian being a fraud doesn't come from his parents, but from Chief O'Brien. And it's the same sort of thing a real person dealing with imposter syndrome might hear from a friend or a loved one. You're not a fraud, O'Brien says. I don't care what was done to you. It didn't give you ambition or a personality or compassion or any of the things that make a person truly human. Which is just another way of saying you are who you are, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with you. You are not deficient. You are enough. O'Brien also tells Bashir that despite his certainty that this means the end of his career, he can't be sure what will happen next, and that turns out to be true. With Captain Sisko's help, a compromise is reached with Starfleet. His father does have to go to prison, because, obviously. But Julian is allowed to remain in the service, and as it turns out, once his friends and colleagues know the truth about him, they accept him for who he really is. Though Chief O'Brien does insist on certain accommodations when they play darts from now on, strictly in the interest of fairness. There's another lesson to be taken from this, I think, and that is, if you feel like you have imposter syndrome, if you feel like you're not good enough, if you feel like you don't really deserve what you have, that's okay too. Your feelings are valid, and there's nothing wrong with you because you feel them. One of the real accomplishments of Deep Space Nine in this area is that it doesn't lead us to think less of its heroes for their self-doubts, their insecurities, their suspicions that they don't belong or they aren't good enough. These thoughts and feelings are presented as characteristics through which we can identify with these larger-than-life heroes living their impossible lives. We'll never have the same experience as Captain Sisko, but I'll bet we've all felt the way he feels sometimes. That's an important thing to keep in mind, not just when we're watching Star Trek, but when we cross paths with one another as we each try to navigate our own human adventure. I want to thank D-Nautics for commissioning this video. D-Nautics, I hope I did okay with your excellent topic. Commissions for videos are currently closed, but if and when I decide to open them up again, I will be sure to let you all know. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or making a one-time donation via the thanks button or through PayPal or Venmo. Links to those are in the description. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Take care, everybody.